Welcome to using multiple files and file groups. Within SQL Server, we have the concept of files and we have the concept of file groups. File groups are logical containers that allow us to control what files objects are going to be created in. So file groups give us the ability to put specific tables into specific physical files. Now, each file group is going to have one or more physical files contained within it. These files are then going to be laid out on the hard drive in various configurations, depending on what our requirements are. One technique a lot of people will use is they'll have one file group for their base table and a second file group for the indexes on those tables. That way, as the writes are coming in and as I/O is being pushed down to the hard drive, you're going to get additional I/O capabilities because you've got your file groups laid out on different physical disks. Now, database files are the actual physical files that hold the information that's stored within our data. When we create a table, we don't tell SQL Server which file to store the table in. We tell SQL Server which file group to store the table in, and then SQL Server puts that table in whatever files make up that file group. When you have multiple files within a single file group, SQL Server is going to do its best to use what's called proportional fill. And what that's going to do is it's going to try to keep the amount of data within those files equal. You want to make sure when you're setting up your files that you set the files up at the same size with the same growth settings so that when the files are filling with data, they fill evenly so that SQL Server can distribute the load evenly across all the files within the file group. Now, when you're creating database files, those files can be created at any size and on any disk. And that includes network shares. Now, if you're going to use network shares, be very, very careful. You want to make sure that you're using Windows Server 2012 or higher for both the file server and the SQL Server. Now, this is because Windows Server 2012 uses some enhancements through the network sharing protocol called SMB, which will dramatically increase the performance of your network traffic as the SQL Server is accessing the data file on a network share. Now, most people are just going to put their database files on a local hard drive. So when you're creating these database files, they can be put on any local hard drive. It doesn't really matter what's underneath. SQL Server doesn't know the difference. As long as there's a drive letter that it can use to reference the files, SQL Server will be able to do that. Now, files can be added using either T-SQL or Management Studio. So let's go ahead and take a look at how we actually do that in Management Studio and the T-SQL commands that are used to do the same. Here we have Management Studio, and you can see we have several databases. So let's go ahead and look at the sample database. If we look at the properties of this database, we'll see we have two database files, which is the minimum number of files we're going to have. We have a data file and a transaction log file. On the File Groups tab, we have a single file group listed. So first, let's go ahead and look at how we create additional file groups. So we can do this by simply clicking Add and giving the file group a name. Let's call this one Second Group. We do not want to make this the default file group because right now we don't have any files in it. At this point, we could click OK, and we would add the file group into the database, even though there are no files in that file group. But let's go ahead and click on Script so we can take a look at the T-SQL syntax that's going to get used to actually create that. So we're going to click Cancel on this dialog so we can look at the SQL script. So as you can see, it's a simple alter database statement. Alter database, sample database, add file group, and then the name of the file group that we're going to add. If we go ahead and execute this, the file group will then be added to the database, which we'll see when we bring back the properties. So we can see we've now got our file group added to the database. Now, if we go to the Files tab, we can go ahead and add new files to the database. Simply click on Add, give it a name. Now, this name is going to be the logical name. So this is the name within the database, as opposed to the actual physical file name. I'm going to go ahead and call my file Second File 1. The file type is going to be rows data. The file group is going to be Second Group. We're going to go ahead and give it an initial size of 100 megs. We're going to use an autogrowth setting of 100 megs. And we can see here the path is the default path that we're going to go ahead and create this file in. Now there's no file name by default. If we leave the file name column blank, then SQL Server will simply use the logical name as the file name with the file extension of NDF. Now if we click OK, SQL Server will go ahead and add the file, but before we do that, let's again click Script so we can see what the actual SQL script looks like. So as you can see here, we've got an alter database command. Let me go ahead and make this a little more readable by changing the layout here. So as you can see, we've got alter database, the name of the database. We're adding a file. We're giving that file a name. We're using a file name parameter to specify the actual path to the file. We're setting the size and the file growth, both in kilobytes. And then we're specifying what file group we want to create that on, in this case, second group. If we were to run this, SQL Server will then go ahead and create the file and add it to the database, which we can then see when we look at the database properties. We can see the new file has been added here as second file 1, and it's on the file group second group. So in summary, we can add database files either to increase space within the database or to fix performance problems, depending on what we're trying to solve for. If we simply run out of space in our database, we have another drive letter that has plenty of free space on it. We can simply add a database file to the database, so the database can then grow onto that drive by using the space within that new file. On the other hand, if we need greater performance out of our SQL Server and we can't change the disk configuration under the SQL Server, what we might do is create multiple disks with high I/O performance capabilities and put one small data file on each one. Then SQL Server will distribute the data from the database across those multiple files so that when we go to access those files on the hard drive, we get the performance that we're looking for. File groups can also be used to separate either indexes from tables or to isolate tables from each other. Perhaps we've got staging tables and then we've got production tables in a data warehouse. We don't want to be reading from our staging tables and writing to the physical tables of the data warehouse all at the same time. So what we could do is we could have a staging file group and a production file group. We then would load our data into the staging group, do whatever alterations we need to it, and then read from those staging tables right into the production tables. This way we isolate the I/O of each of those sets of tables from each other by putting them into their own file groups.